right, our second Minnesota speaker is Melissa Wilson. She's an associate professor at the Department of Soil, Water and Climate, and she is our manure specialist. So welcome.
All right, hopefully everyone can hear me. Hopefully outside of the room, they can hear me great. So they always put me on after lunch to talk about manure. At least I'm not like right after lunch today. But we're going to talk about manure phosphorus. I don't have a lot of stuff talking about soils in here because it sounds like y'all covered that pretty well earlier today. So I'm mainly going to talk about these three things. What kind of phosphorus is in manure? How does it get there? What can we expect? How much can we expect to find? And what are some of the land application considerations? So I always like to start about thinking about what is manure. Manure we often think about as just the feces, right? But it also has a lot of urine in it, but it has a lot of bedding, a lot of feed, wasted feed, a lot of water, etc. So what's really determining our nutrient content here is animal species and diet. How these animals digest their food is going to influence things. Their housing and bedding, dilution from water. In a year like this past year where we had a lot of rainwater, especially early in the season, that's going to affect our nutrient concentrations. And then how that manure is stored and handled. When we're thinking about animal species and diet, I like the phrase, what goes in must come out. Sometimes I joke that feed is just pre-manure. They say that like 75% of the nutrients that you're purchasing and feeding your animals comes out the back end. So that's actually a lot. Like we're thinking of feed as like this high price thing that we're putting into our animals to get them the best nutrition possible. But really they're pooping out 75% of what we actually paid for. So how that influences our nutrients is obviously dependent on how much phosphorus we're giving our animals. There's also differences between species. Ruminants versus monogastric species will digest things differently. Cattle have those four compartments of their stomach. They're going to digest things differently than something that has one stomach. And then we have our herbivores versus our omnivores. You can actually go like down a real dark rabbit hole with some of this stuff when you start looking into how animals digest their food. And I know I'm a nerd, so I would actually go down that rabbit hole. But it's really fascinating learning about the difference between even like horses and pigs. Horses, because they are used to eating like grass-fed diets, they actually have to digest a much harder to digest food than an omnivore like a pig. So they have a whole longer hind gut than a pig would. It's, again, sorry that I'm a bit of a nerd, but it's fascinating. The other thing we have going on there is our diet. Obviously, the more phosphorus you feed these animals, the more they're going to leave the back end. We also have more and more additives. A lot of people, for instance, are adding phytase to our swine diets and our poultry diets. And phytase is an enzyme that actually helps the animal break down phosphorus from their feed. Phosphorus in feed is primarily it's in phytate, which is a plant molecule, and phytase helps break that down. Now, there's bacteria in the guts of cattle that actually naturally do this. Those bacteria aren't present in swine and poultry, so that's why we figured out that we could add the phytase ourselves, and that helps the animals be more efficient. So that will change how much phosphorus is coming out the back end as well. And then we found that even food processing, so this picture here shows us that the size that they're actually grinding the food to can play a role too. Something that is finer ground, has more surface area, therefore the stomach fluids and whatnot are able to utilize that phosphorus a little bit better than something that's more coarsely ground. Of course, that can be problematic. If you grind it too fine, they actually found out that backs up the animals. So, don't want that happening either. So there's a fine balance when thinking about food processing. But again, I like to mention it because it does affect what comes out to the rear end. So what are the forms of phosphorus in manure? Typically, like most nutrients, we're seeing organic portions, which are bound to carbon. And in this case, it's mostly phytate, which is what we see here, this complicated molecule. The carbon is in the center here, the center ring. And then there's these phosphorus units that are around this outer ring. And then we have our inorganic phosphorus, which can be orthophosphates that might be dissolved in the liquids, or it could be struvite, other minerals like that as well. So the inorganic phosphorus is typically the more readily plant available. So the orthophosphates are what plants take up. Struvite is something that can be dissolved pretty quickly into those orthophosphates. So we consider inorganic P the really readily available stuff. The organic P usually has to be broken down in order for that phosphorus to release. And that enzyme that I was talking about, that phytase, does help cleave off these phosphorus units. So that's one of the reasons why we add phytase to the diets of the animals that need it. Here's the forms of phosphorus typically found in manure. This is data from one of our colleagues here at the University of Minnesota, Paolo Pagliari. He did some extractions where they kind of do more strongly acidic extractions over time to see, kind of dictate how much of this phosphorus is readily available or less readily available, et cetera. So what they found is that most manure, most of it, over 50% in most cases, is inorganic phosphorus. Another percentage, the bigger percentage, is usually organic phosphorus. And then they do have components where they're pretty sure it's organic phosphorus, but it's so tightly bound that they don't really know what it is or what form it's in. So they call that residue phosphorus. And that's just stuff that is usually tied up in some sort of metal or mineral such that it's not going to be dissolved anytime soon, even with the strongest acids. So it's interesting to see how this changes by different animals. So we have horse, goat, sheep, poultry, turkey, swine, beef, and dairy. So that gives you an idea of what phosphorus might look like in manure. The other thing we have to think about then is how much phosphorus might be come out of the animals, but then once it's in storage, what changes with phosphorus? With nitrogen, there's actually a lot of nitrogen losses during storage and handling. With phosphorus, it's not typically as high. Usually for most storages, it's 5 to 15%, but there's two exceptions. Open paved feedlots, we might see 20 to 40% of our phosphorus lost. Although if you have a collection system, you're collecting most of that phosphorus and you can reapply it then. For lagoons, and I'm using the actual engineering term here, a lagoon is a treatment system that is actually meant to treat manure. We don't have lagoons in Minnesota. We have earthen basins. I know sometimes people call them lagoons, but engineering-wise, they're not actually lagoons. So I'm not talking about earthen storages here. I'm talking about actual lagoons where it just sits for a long time. They take the water off the top and irrigate it. That's the kind of lagoon I'm talking about. In that case, they're losing 50 to 85% of their phosphorus. And that's because most of it settles and is in those solids. Now, a lot of these lagoons that we have down south, they're only cleaning those out every 10 to 20 years. So at that 10 to 20 year mark, when they're cleaning that out, they do recover a lot of that phosphorus. The problem is then what do you do with 10 to 20 years of phosphorus coming from one place, right? You have to spread it over a large portion of land. So those are kind of the two systems where we may see more losses than standard. So how much phosphorus is actually in manure? This is one of my favorite pictures. This is a horse farm where they're stacking their manure and they had this funny sign that says manure happens. So it's now my favorite picture ever. So historically, what is in manure? A lot of times people use what are called book values. And this is just like usually a standard number, an average number somewhere from some reference that you get to kind of tell you what you might expect in manure. We have two big sources of book values. They might be the American Society of Agricultural and Biological Engineers, or ASABE. The other one is the Midwest Plan Service, or in this case, I'll probably talk about it as the MWPS. Both of these, if you actually look at their methodology and dates, a lot of their book values are from like the 1990s or 2000s. I am very shocked to find out recently that it's 2025. So it's 25 years now that they've had these same numbers, and things have changed since then. We already talked about diets have changed. We know that housing has changed. There's a lot like of our swine production systems. They're moving from kind of separate waterers and feeders, which were really inefficient, to wet dry feeders, where now they're very, very efficient with their water. So we're seeing a lot less dilution. Our manure handling and storage is different, and we're getting a lot more of these additives like that phytase that I was talking about earlier. So as things are different and changing, we need a new way to create dynamic book values. So this is an idea that I pitched to a couple different organizations, and we were luckily able to get funding to build a database of manure nutrient analysis data. So the idea was that we have all these agricultural labs across the country, and they're shown here, that are analyzing manure every year. Some of these labs are analyzing thousands upon thousands of samples of manure every year. What if we collated all that data so that we could actually get a real picture of what manure looks like today, and then keep that going forward so that we can kind of see how things are changing over time? Then the idea would be to actually provide that data publicly. And that might look like something here, and I'll kind of show a graphic of this later, where you can see what the average ranges of nutrients look like for different species, even different places across the country. Is it the same? Is hog manure here in Minnesota the same as down in Iowa or in North Carolina? Probably not. Maybe closer to Iowa, but maybe not so much North Carolina, where they're using these lagoon systems. So that was our idea. And luckily, like I said, we got funding for this, and this is actually live. You can check out this website. I have a QR code here, or go to our Z link, z.umn.edu/ManureDB. We have now over 5 million data points in there. We've collected lab data from 16 labs across the US. There's still some areas where we have more data than others, but you can actually look up by year, you can look up by species. I'm not going to pull up the website just because that does take time and logistics to do, but you can actually look up what manure might look like in the different regions across the US, or if you want to look at a national picture, you can do that as well. And we're continuously adding data. We just set out our call to labs to submit their 2024 data, so hopefully annually we'll be adding to this database and making it bigger over time. One of the cool things that we've been able to see is changes in manure over time. Our first request from the labs is like, can you give us all the data that you have? And some of them were able to go back to 2001. That's like the limit to where their computer systems were storing the data in some cases. And this isn't from all 16 labs, but we do have data back to 2001 from some labs at least. And this is what phosphorus looks like. And this is just for the Midwest region, which is kind of shown up here: Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Minnesota, Missouri, Ohio, and Wisconsin. And this is P2O5 in pounds per 1,000 gallons of swine finisher manure. So you can see that when we started introducing phytase in the early 2000s, that really did decrease the amount of phosphorus we were seeing in manure on average. And then since then, it's kind of leveled out, where sometimes it's a little lower, sometimes it's a little higher. So that was really interesting to see, because at first when they added phytase, we were actually seeing more phosphorus in the manure because they were literally pooping more phosphorus out that was available. And then once we started realizing that because we were increasing the amount of phosphorus that's released to the animals, we didn't have to feed them as much. So they were able to start ratcheting down the amount of phosphorus going into the diets, and that's why we see this decrease over time. But now we are seeing a little bit less phosphorus in our manure than we were previously. So it's kind of a cool thing to be able to see with this data set that we haven't been able to see previously, at least with how many samples. We have 2,000 samples represented here. Before, it might have been like, one barn here or there had tracked it for that long, kind of thing. So here's some other data. This is actually data from 2012 to 2021 here in the upper Midwest, primarily Minnesota-based labs. They might have labs outside of Minnesota, but they do have labs here. And I kind of want to quick summarize this for you. I'm going to show you a couple different graphics, but I'll explain the swine liquid one first. This is going to be the nutrient content from 0 to 70 pounds, and it's either pounds per 1,000 gallons if it's a liquid manure, or it's pounds per ton if it's a solid manure. The first one that we have here, the first circle, is total nitrogen. The red diamond is total ammonium nitrogen. That is part of total nitrogen, but I wanted to kind of break that out to show you what that looks like. And then we have total phosphorus as P2O5 in the yellow triangle, and total K as K2O in the gray square. The error bars then show you the middle 50% of all of the data we have. So we did cut out outliers that were outside of that 50%. So this gives you like a good range, like average range of what you can expect swine manure to look like. Here's poultry, solids, beef solids, and dairy liquids. Across the bottom, I have how many samples are represented in that graph. Those hog people really like measuring their nutrients in their manure. It's 49,000, about 9,000 or 10,000 for dairy and poultry, and then our beef are about 5,000. But looking at this data, you probably notice a couple things. One, we have a lot more nutrients in our poultry and our swine compared to our beef and dairy. And that doesn't necessarily mean they're better or worse nutrients or manure nutrient sources. They just have to apply more of the dairy and the beef. There's a lot more variability in our swine and poultry than our beef and dairy, and that's for a couple reasons. One, here in the Midwest, we typically see in our cattle operations where all the manure goes into one. It doesn't matter like what life stage we're talking about, it usually goes into one storage. So it's a little more mixed versus swine and poultry are not well integrated, and that the different life stages are differently separated out, and the manure is handled maybe even slightly differently. But with all of our, one of the limitations of this database is that the lab gets swine manure. They don't get, this is a swine finishing bar that had all of these treatments done to it, right? Because people are just filling this out and sending it to lab. They don't fill out a lot of the details. So we can't tell if this is a finisher manure or a swine nursery barn. We just know that it's swine. So we do have those life stages included within that data set. But one thing people say was like, well, if you're getting all these book values, we don't need to test our manure anymore. Would you say based on this data, you'd want to stop testing your manure? I'm seeing one person shake his head no, so that's good. You definitely still want to keep testing your own specific barn. For instance, if you have a swine finishing barn and you think you're running about 45 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 gallons, but you're actually at 60, you're probably overapplying your manure. You probably could have spread that out on more acres. On the other hand, if you thought you had 45 and you have 30, you're significantly underapplying your manure and you're going to see a yield hit. So this really goes to show that it's still very important to measure your own manure. Plus, who knows, maybe it'll actually end up in our database someday. The one thing about our database is that it is private. Like, we don't have them send any customer information with us. We maybe get the first, like the zip code, and then we actually erase the last 3 digits of the zip code, or the last 2 digits of the zip code. So we only ever have 3 digits of the zip code in there just for privacy reasons. We don't want someone to be able to pick out like, oh, I know there's only this one swine operation in Minnesota, so therefore it must be this one. Like, that kind of stuff gets taken out so that we don't have that sort of thing happening. But anyways, check out the data if you are interested in seeing it. If you run across any errors or anything, certainly let us know about that too. We're constantly updating this and trying to make it more user-friendly when we can. All right, land application considerations. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the manure nutrient availability research that we're doing, particularly surrounding phosphorus. So one of the things that is unique about manure compared to fertilizers is it turns out it's not just P. It's not just our phosphorus. It comes with all the other nutrients as well. And sometimes those ratio of nutrients is going to dictate how you want to apply this manure. So if we're thinking about most crops, most of them are taking up roughly 5 units of nitrogen for every 1 unit of phosphorus that they need. This changes based on crop, but we'll just kind of make it nice and easy there, 5 to 1. So if we look at our available nitrogen to phosphorus ratio, so this is first year available phosphorus nitrogen ratio based on that data that I just showed you. Swine manure is typically 4 units of nitrogen to 1 unit of phosphorus. Dairy manure is 2 to 1, sorry. Beef manure is 2 to 1. Dairy manure is 3 to 1, and most of our poultry is 2 to 1. So that means you're going to be over applying or under applying something whenever you apply manure. If we're looking at this on a nitrogen basis, so let's say we get all these up to 5, that means for swine, we're applying 1.25 units of phosphorus. And you know, for 1 year, if we are carrying over 0.25 into the soybean, maybe that's not so bad. We need to maybe still apply some more phosphorus into that soybean, but there is a little bit of carryover there. Look at our beef and our poultry though. For every 5 units of nitrogen, you're getting 2.5 units of phosphorus. And this is where we start to consider how often we actually want to be applying these manures in a rotation, what that rotation looks like. Because if you are applying these to continuous corn every year, this is how you very quickly build up soil test phosphorus levels in your operation. And in places like I worked previously in Maryland, where they actually have regulations based on soil test phosphorus, they can get it to the point where they're no longer allowed to apply any kind of phosphorus-bearing materials in that state. And that's a big deal when you're a livestock operation. So let's not get to that point in Minnesota, right? Think about testing your soils regularly and think about the rotation. For instance, I know there's several people who are just crop farmers and all livestock, but they do get like poultry litter and they'll do it every 3 to 4 years because it gives them that phosphorus boost for several years at that point, and then they aren't building up their soil test phosphorus to really, really high levels. This is kind of an example of what that might look like. Again, when I was in Maryland, I worked with nutrient management planners. And in Maryland, you have to be certified to be a nutrient management planner. So this guy came to us. He was looking at he wanted to use his dairy manure, but he had high soil phosphorus test levels. So he's getting a little bit worried about that. And in this scenario, we have manure applied at the nitrogen-based rate or the phosphorus-based rate. So this first graph shows the nitrogen-based rate. The black outline shows you how much nitrogen, phosphorus, or potassium he needed based on soil test levels or the nutrient management guidelines for that state and that region. So if you wanted to apply enough manure to apply full nitrogen needs, in that case, he's going to double apply how much phosphorus he needed and even over apply the potash as well a little bit. So in this case, because he was worried about regulations, we said, what if you backed off the manure application rates to just apply the phosphorus needs of the crop? The blue portion of the bar then shows how much fertilizer he was going to have to purchase. So again, in this case, it's a trade-off. In one case, he can use the manure he needs for his field, and then he doesn't have to purchase any fertilizers, but he could be subject to regulations in the future where he no longer can apply manure to those fields. On the other hand, he can apply a lower rate, but he has to purchase fertilizer. So it's something that like our farmers are having to consider with manure. And because we always run into extreme examples, I always like to show this example as well. This is a farmer who was on the border between Maryland and Pennsylvania, and he wanted to import chicken litter from Pennsylvania into Maryland. Needed to apply 200 pounds of nitrogen, 47 pounds of phosphorus, and 52 pounds of potash based on soil tests. And because it was like a free source, all he had to do was ship it. He wanted to apply 5 tons per acre, which in general, if you've ever worked with turkey litter or chicken litter or anything, that's kind of a high rate. Usually we're talking 2 to 3 tons. So 5 was a lot. They tested it, and we actually called because we were like, well, this is wrong. But if he wanted to apply at 5 tons, he would have put on 151 pounds of nitrogen, which is not even full nitrogen needs of that crop. He was going to over apply phosphorus. He was going to apply 426 pounds of phosphorus and 421 pounds of potash. I don't know what happened that the nitrogen was so low on this manure, but the P and K were so high. But at that rate, this is how you become regulated in Maryland very fast, like within a year. So we suggested he not do this because you don't want to become regulated that quickly. But it goes to show that testing your manure is extremely important, but also thinking about these nitrogen to phosphorus ratios as well. All right, so one of the first experiments I started when I started my position, I started in 2017, so this would have started in 2018, was to look at nitrogen and phosphorus availability of different manure types. So we had 6 different types of manure. We did a bedded beef pack, a liquid dairy manure that was raw, a liquid dairy manure that had gone through the liquid solid separation system, a turkey litter, a composted chicken manure that's sold at your local hardware store, probably called Chickadee Doo or something along those lines, and then a swine finishing liquid manure as well. The goal was to apply this at a nitrogen-based rate of 140 pounds of first-year plant available nitrogen. So we used our current guidelines to apply it at that base rate. And then we had phosphorus and nitrogen fertilizer response curves. So then we had plots that did like anywhere from 0 to 120% of what we thought the nitrogen rates should be. Those also got full P, full K, full sulfur, et cetera. And then we had plots where they had full nitrogen rates, full K, full sulfur, but we just changed the phosphorus just to kind of see where manures fell out along the phosphorus or nitrogen fertilizer curves. We did these both in southern Minnesota, one at Waseca, one at Lamberton, and then we had 2 sites that started in 2 different years. We then monitored those sites, so we applied the manure in either 2018 or 2019, and then we did not apply any more manure in those fields. We did apply the phosphorus and nitrogen fertilizers, though, to just the fertilizer-only plots the rest of the study. Again, to see what like 2nd year, 3rd year credits might look like for the manure. But keep in mind, 2018 and 2019, those were 2 very wet years. We'll talk about that later. Just some more details. Again, in year one, we applied, our full nitrogen rate was 140 pounds of nitrogen per acre. We were following soybean. We applied 6 different manures. We also had plots that were just nitrogen fertilizers or phosphorus fertilizers. And then in years 2 or 3 for the manure plots, we only applied potash and sulfur. And then we still had our nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizer curves as well. But the full nitrogen rate for that was 195 pounds of nitrogen because we were doing continuous corn at that point. Here's a picture taken at the S-Rock. This is corn. Remember, we were trying to apply the same nitrogen rate regardless of manure. But then we saw this. This is a bedded beef pack corn, and this is a turkey litter corn, even though we had the same nitrogen rate. Looks like maybe we weren't actually getting the same nitrogen rate that we were thinking, right? Smaller corn, probably not seeing as much nitrogen as we expected. Here are the overhead aerial shots. This is our first replicate. This is all of our different plots. It ended up being 16 plots. And then here's our rep 2. We also had rep 3 and 4 for each of these, but just had room for 2. And you can kind of see a couple different things. One, you can see our 0 fertilizer plots here pretty easily. Definitely the rows aren't nearly as closed. One of the interesting things is that our bedded beef pack looked kind of the same as our no nitrogen plots, which is always fun when you thought you applied 140 pounds of nitrogen. This is just the same photo taken later in the season. Again, here's that bedded beef plot, and then here's a 0 fertilizer nitrogen. So it looks like maybe there's a little bit slightly darker green, but definitely nitrogen deficient based on the yellowing that we saw in those plots. So here is the first year of the rotation. Corn followed soybean. We have our corn yield in bushels per acre from 0 to 240. And then we have manure source, or our nitrogen rate only curve, or our phosphorus rate only curve. You can see that there is definitely some yield differences across our different manure types. Here we have our swine manure, which is a swine finishing manure, bedded beef pack. This is our raw dairy liquid. This is our separated dairy liquid, our chicken layer, composted chickadee doo, hardware store manure, and our turkey. Yeah, that composted chicken layer manure looks really good, doesn't it? But obviously, again, we tried to apply these all at the same nitrogen rate, and we did not see that. Here's our nitrogen rate curve. Yields range from, about 90 to 200 bushels per acre. And there was more yield response to nitrogen than there was phosphorus, but there was a yield response to phosphorus as well. Yields range from about 160 to 200 in that case. So one of the things that we like to do is we actually measure the nutrient uptake of these to try to determine what the fertilizer equivalency was of these plots. So this is what the nitrogen uptake looked like of our manure plots compared to the nitrogen uptake of the nitrogen fertilizer rate plots. And then what we can do is we can actually generate an equation that predicts what the nitrogen uptake looked like based on the nitrogen rate. And then we can compare our manured plots to that, and that basically will give us what our actual fertilizer rate looked like. And then we can do that for phosphorus as well. One of the things I like to show here is that with nitrogen, you can see that the nitrogen pretty much followed the same pattern that we saw with yield, versus phosphorus, not as much. So again, it shows that nitrogen is the main nutrient that we're looking at here, but phosphorus definitely played a role. And we can do the same thing though with phosphorus. We can predict what our phosphorus uptake looked like. So remember, we had 4 sites where we did this, 2 at Waseca, 2 at Lamberton, and that were in 2 different years. So averaged over all of those, this is what our P fertilizer equivalent value looked like. So on average, we got between 30, for most of the manures around 30s, for most of the manures, and then the chicken layer composted manure was 77, which is a lot. And then our turkey litter was about 47 pounds of phosphorus. What's interesting though is how much we applied. So this last column here shows us the percent of P that was available, which is the fertilizer equivalent value divided by the total P applied. So most of them, well, it's kind of ranged. For bedded beef pack was 32%. For composted chicken layer, we got 77 pounds of fertilizer out of there. And that was only 39% of what we had applied. We applied a lot of phosphorus with that composted turkey layer manure. Dairy raw, we got 73% out. The dairy separated wasn't too far off, about 69%. But the real story here is this one, the swine finishing manure. We somehow got 145% of the phosphorus out of what we applied. And that is interesting because it was fairly consistent across all 4 sites. One of the things that we're thinking, and we have to figure out how to like test this, but remember how I talked about phytase earlier and phytase being added to diets for swine now? You know, what goes in must come out. So is that phytase coming out of the back end of these animals and then actually causing more phosphorus to be released from the soil than would normally be released? Maybe that's what's going on here. And we have had like anecdotally people talking about, swine farmers talking about how they used to have so much phosphorus that it get them through their corn soybean rotation. And now they're feeling like it's not. They're feeling like they're seeing P deficiency on their soybeans without adding more. So now they're starting to add more. But this might be why maybe we had been mining phosphorus from the soils for a little bit in some of these. But again, it's still just like a theory in my head, theoretically, what's going on. We'd have to figure out how to test for this. So here's our 2nd-year corn. We obviously did not apply any more nitrogen or phosphorus to the manure plots. So you can see they didn't yield too well, but they did yield probably a little bit better than the 0 plot. And then here's our 3rd year of the corn rotation, and averaged over 4 years, we actually saw slightly higher yields in that 3rd year, probably just due to the kind of those weather conditions that we had throughout those growing periods. But still, either way, probably have a little bit of a nitrogen credit, and then I'll show you what phosphorus looks like here too. Here's our 2nd-year phosphorus data, and then here's our 3rd-year phosphorus data. In most cases, we were not getting that much phosphorus the 2nd year out of this. It was about 6% for most manures, except for our poultry manures. There we got 10 to 17 pounds that 2nd year, which that's actually a lot, but knowing how much phosphorus was in that composted chicken, poultry litter, whatever it was a lot of phosphorus. Then our 3rd year, it was very low as well. Again, still most out of that poultry litter though, 6 to 7 pounds. So kind of interesting results. Mainly, again, this is a nitrogen study, but we also were looking at the phosphorus just because with manure, you have to look at both. You can't kind of alter the 2 separately. So we were seeing really interesting things. And as any good research project does, it leaves you with a lot of questions as well. And one of the questions we have is like, what was going on with that swine manure the 1st year? So we'll hopefully be looking that into the future. So take-home messages. Manure applied during wet years had lower nitrogen availability than expected. I didn't want to focus on that today just because this is a phosphorus title or phosphorus talk. But it was very wet and we did not get the nitrogen out of that manure that we thought we would. Probably because leaching or denitrification occurred, again, very wet years, that would be expected. But with the phosphorus data, it really goes to show that variable phosphorus uptake between years. It's really important to constantly be testing your soils, not constantly, but like regularly be testing your soils for phosphorus buildup to make sure that you're not over applying phosphorus in these systems. And it's especially important, it looks like in those poultry systems, because they just have so much phosphorus in them. So thank you. Thanks to our funding sources. Follow me on LinkedIn or the platform formerly known as Twitter, X these days. I also just found out I have to call it the Gulf of America now. That was a fun one. So formerly known as the Gulf of America or Gulf of Mexico. But do we have time for questions? I have to go to the next one. All right, how does Manure DB values compare to the old Midwest Plan Service and ASABE book values? So that one is that it depends. For some of them with swine, it actually looks fairly decent if you look at the high and low ASABE versus Midwest Plan Service values. Usually the Manure DB values are somewhere in between for swine manure. I think it was for dairy or beef. Sometimes I get those mixed in my head, but our newer values are lower than what the plan service were. And I'm forgetting for poultry, it was either similar to or lower than as well. I have those slides somewhere and I was looking at them last night, but I did not include them here for the sake of time. But in some cases, they're different. All right, the slide referring to uptake ratios, is that considering stover removal? In that case, it is not. What we did for uptake ratios is we collected grain, cobs, and stover separately, and we did measure it in the entire thing. So that is not necessarily including if the stover were to go back on the ground. And then that would be put back into the soil. Does that make sense? So in that case, it's thinking that would be all removed. That's how much was taken up. And then question on composted versus raw. Most of the time I see manure analysis, it's just pounds per acre P2O5. It doesn't really distinguish inorganic versus organic. Does composting change the availability of phosphorus in the manure? And does it impact the proportion of manure P that can be lost in runoff? That's a great question. Most of our work for availability in composted versus raw is done on nitrogen. I am not thinking of what availability looks like, but in most cases, availability for phosphorus tends to be high, anywhere from 80 to 100% in most manure types. In Minnesota, we typically go with a slightly lower percentage, but even down in Maryland, they use assumed 100 even for composts. So I would think that it's probably still going to be fairly available within that first year. Dan, do you have any comments on availability in composted versus raw manure? Yeah, it's about the same, I assume. What was I forget the second part of that question. Sorry, someone took it off the screen a little too early. In the difference in manure source data versus yield response, you hypothesize that the seed-end ratio is a component to this response. That's an interesting question. We know obviously the carbon to nitrogen ratio is important for nitrogen release. I don't know if it's as big of a deal for phosphorus, typically because phosphorus is more being released by enzymes rather than bacteria as much. So I'm thinking that it probably doesn't have as much, but that's a really interesting question. Is your guidance for first year P availability less than 100% going to be adopted by manure testing labs? I think we still see 100% first year available. I believe we've been using 80% availability since before my time. So I don't know what the labs are using. Sometimes I like to tease my lab managers that we're working with, like, where do you even come up with these numbers? But I think some of them are using 80%, at least some of the ones I work with, but that's a good question. I think some of the labs work across state guidelines, so that's where we get some of the confusion. Yeah.
On that point, with your latest research with NP availability, is that being translated to MPCA with manure management plans?
Yeah,
Because
so
that's an issue.
yeah, the question is about the nitrogen availability and phosphorus availability. Is that being translated to MPCA? Yeah, I'm the person in between everyone, being pulled in all the directions. Yeah, so I try to talk with them regularly. There are some things that from what I understand, are in the rules already, like well before my time, that there's not much we can do. Those have to be changed when the rule opens. And that's done by legislators, so you know how that goes. But we try to keep everyone in the loop. We try to talk about this stuff as much as we can. I haven't published this stuff yet, so a lot of the data I showed you is still kind of preliminary because we'd like to make sure that there's, not differences between years, and we want to always do quality check for our data and stuff like that too. So we're still working on some of that, but we're trying to keep in touch with everyone at the table. One of the things we'll be doing with nitrogen is changing how we calculate availability factors pretty soon. Right now we have a total nitrogen rate multiplied by a factor, but that doesn't really show any differences whether it's a liquid or a solid, and we know liquid or solids release nutrients differently, particularly nitrogen. So we'll be changing that. It's more just I need to make sure all my ducks are in a row and that I have good numbers for you all.
Thank you.